The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Mental Illness Disproves God. This video is going to be a little bit different than most of the other ones. The Atheist Debates project exists primarily to help teach other non-believers what my thoughts are on how to have better arguments, what sort of things I find compelling and not compelling. We can go through logical arguments and objections and things in the Bible that I found curious, and I look forward to doing all of those. But this video is for, well, I was going to say my apologist friends, but I'm not sure how many apologist friends I still have. But if you are an apologist, and particularly a Christian apologist, I am more interested in your thoughts on this than pretty much anything I've ever done, because this is an issue I've struggled with for a long time. I've talked about it briefly, but I haven't done, I don't think, a video specifically on this, because I think there is a strong defeater, and in philosophy, essentially, it is the thing that disproves a particular claim, a defeater for some, if not most, versions of Christianity and similar theologies that are about judging individuals on their thoughts and deeds. Now, first of all, if you do not think that Christianity is ultimately going to be advocating for a position where God judges individuals based on their thoughts and deeds, then this video isn't for you. If you've got some kind of non-typical, custom, esoteric version of Christianity, if you want to, comment down below that all the other Christians have it wrong and you have it right, that's your prerogative. But I grew up as a Southern Baptist fundamentalist. On occasionally, I enjoyed going to Pentecostal churches. And what the Bible seems to teach, in my understanding, and what most versions of Christianity that I've engaged with seem to teach, is that after you die, you will be judged on, they can phrase it a number of different ways, the content of your character, your thoughts and deeds. And God's keeping a record of everything you've ever done. You will be held accountable for it. I think that this is actually a defeater for that, and it's about, in part, mental illness, but we'll see that it's worse than just dealing with mental illness. We live in a world where there are a number of mental conditions that someone can wind up being diagnosed with that are not the result of any act of that individual or volition that we can tell. It's just, hey, you managed to get schizophrenia. You managed to get some other condition where your understanding of and assessment of reality is skewed in a way that you have no control over. It's not your choice. And I don't know how a God or anyone could look at someone and say, despite your mental illness, despite the cognitive aberrations that you have that skew your understanding of and perception of reality, I'm still going to judge you as if you didn't have those conditions. I've thought through the potential responses that some theists and apologists might give. I'm not going to claim this is exhaustive. I'm doing all this in one take, mostly off the top of my head after a long time thinking about this. But theists might say, well, God judges our heart. Okay, well, that's really cool as a poetic thing. But the heart that you're talking about is still my mind. Or as far as we can tell, it's still my mind. My physical heart pumps blood. It doesn't think. It doesn't have character. And so when you say that God doesn't judge our mind, he's judging our hearts, you're equivocating between two things that are essentially the same, because the heart that you're talking about is my character. It's still the mind. And you might say, well, no. When I say that God judges your heart, what I mean is that God judges your soul, and that is not the same thing as the mind. And to be fair, we don't have sufficient evidence to justify the notion that there's a soul at all. But for the sake of this argument, for a moment, let's assume that that's the case, that instead of judging the content of my mind, there's a God that's going to judge the content of my soul. Now, I don't have any reason to think that I have a soul, but I'll go with it for now. And that's because I want to ask a couple questions. First, how do you tell if an action that I take is the result of my damaged brain taking that action and instructing that action, or my soul taking that action? I have no idea. We have no way to confirm that anybody has a soul. We don't have any way to investigate a soul. We have no way to determine, if you did or said something blasphemous, is that a result of a mental aberration from some sort of illness or condition? Or is that your soul? Is it the true you doing it? I have no idea, but the apologist might claim that God does. And, that's fine, but that's a post hoc rationalization that's completely untestable. It's untestable in the sense that, oh, well, no, it's testable, Matt. You'll find out when you're dead. Please, stuff like that is completely unhelpful. This is something you need to understand before you're dead. Coming up with these rationalizations that theists so often do don't help. I'm looking at this as whether or not this is a potential defeater for Christianity. And if the best I get is, well, God knows, then yes, it's a defeater for Christianity. That is an absolute admission of defeat. The notion that God understands it is not only untestable, but it's ultimately circular, because you are assuming, without evidence or justification, that there is a difference between my brain taking an action and my soul as the pilot of the ship taking an action that anyone could discern, including a God. That's an assumption that you don't have warrant for. It's based on certain characteristics that you might think of as God. You might think, well, God is loving and fair and kind, and of course, God's not going to judge you on something that you had no control over. But that doesn't answer, first of all, it doesn't answer how you know that that's the case. It's just kind of your gut feeling and what you'd prefer. But it also doesn't explain why these mental aberrations exist in the first place, and why those people who may have, they have a good soul and it's going to heaven, but their brain is so messed up that they're slaughtering families and causing problems and doing all these things that people would generally consider problematic, if not outright sinful, if they were a believer, and that God would judge them for it. But what if it's not? What if it's a wonderful, caring, loving soul that's just trapped in a body that's so broken that it's causing havoc and creating disruption in the world? God, under their model, under your model, the apologist model, I'd love to hear how mental illness can be reconciled at all with a notion of divine judgment. Because in your model, God made us and the world around us and allowed for mental aberrations, not just minor ones, but ones that provide strong delusions and serial mental processing defects that dramatically impact one's ability to accurately assess reality. But accurately assessing reality is what this is all about. If you don't have the ability to accurately assess reality, how could anyone judge you on your character? Because the processing plant is flawed. If my computer has a busted memory chip and it still manages to boot up, I wouldn't be judging the computer's character. I wouldn't be judging the actual software that's running. There's a hardware malfunction that is preventing the software from running as expected. I see no way to reconcile this beyond appeals to blindly trusting that even though we can't figure it out, God can, which is why so many people go down that road. But it's a little bit worse than that still, because what about when we're too young? What about when we're old and dementia has set in our twilight years? We, humans, in the name of fairness and responsibility, don't tend to hold those people responsible in the same way that we hold other adults responsible who are ostensibly of sound mind and body. That's an important phrase in a legal sense. And I know there's going to be apologists like, that's what Matt's doing. Matt's going into legalism. I don't care what you call it. If I'm going to be judged, and if your assertion is that I'm going to be judged and everybody else is going to be judged, we should know what the criteria are, and we should be able to assess that the judgment system is fair rather than just being told that it is. Those adults who are sound mind and body are held to a different standard than those who aren't. How could a God do any less? How could a God fail to clearly address these conditions and how they play into judgment? That's unusual to me, because you're basically saying that we are treating people in the short term better than a God is going to treat them in the long term. Because the model that you've got is that your God created the universe, put everybody in it, gave us a brain that is our one way to gather and assess information in order to understand reality, made some of those brains in such a way that they can be strongly defective, and then judges them on a set of criteria that, to the best of our understanding, does not take into account those defects. This was such a big problem for church fathers throughout the years that they invented a number of kind of post hoc rationalizations. Things like the age of accountability, the age of responsibility. What's worse is that even without serious mental illness, the mere fact that we're not all created, air quotes, equal, with respect to our ability to conceptualize, process, and reach conclusions is also a defeater for this model. If we're all judged on the same criteria with exactly one path to salvation, and we don't start on equal footing, and some are incapable of ever catching up, even on some of the basics, how is that not self-defeating? In the same way that some people will never understand calculus and let alone deeper mathematical concepts, no matter how much instruction they receive, we're being judged on that ability. Maybe math isn't essential to having an epistemologically sound belief in God, but we don't hold children and the mentally ill equally accountable, and we don't hold them equally accountable to people who are ostensibly of sound mind and body. And if we don't do that, why would a God? Religion's invented unbiblical exceptions to judgment, the age of responsibility, because problems like this plagued folks. If the only path to salvation is a conscious decision to reject sin, repent and turn away from sin, to accept the concept of sin to begin with, and then to accept that Jesus is the Lord and Master and the one path out of sin, surrendering to his will, how can that be for those who cannot grasp these concepts? It may be that merely mental illness isn't the sole defeater for divine judgment, but the entire state of affairs surrounding our brains that is the defeater. Our brains, even when working, may be the defeater for any notion of a just and otherwise absent God being justified and warranted in judging humanity. Ask yourself the questions. How is God going, in your model, going to judge people? And is that fair? Even if you assume that there's a soul, the fact remains we know that there are mental aberrations, mental illness, mental defects, and different cognitive capacities, all of which work together to ensure that we don't all have access to the same information. We don't all have access to the same cognitive abilities to assess and evaluate that information. We are going to come up with wrong answers, and sometimes it's going to be because we're lazy thinkers, which may also be a defeater. I mean, why would, but at a minimum, it may be the case that coming up with different answers is unavoidable and not the direct responsibility of the character, soul, heart, however you want to phrase it, of the person who God's going to judge. And so what I see from most theists is, I have no answer for this. I just trust that God is good and wise and will sort it all out. That's nice, but that means that you haven't countered a defeater, you've just ignored it. And if we find a bunch of defeaters and you ignore them all, wouldn't it be reasonable to conclude that your model is not rational, is not sound, should not be accepted, and is no different from any other proposed fantasy of how an afterlife is going to work. I'm not saying any of this to be dickish towards Christianity. I'm genuinely concerned. If there's going to be a judgment, and the judgment is unjust, how do you continue to hold to those tenets and talk about God being good? Now, I get it. There are some of you out there who will say, I didn't say God was good. I mean, God's good in his character, yes, but that doesn't mean we understand the good or anything else. I want to hear how Christians justify a world of mental illness, not why mental illness exists. I don't want to hear how human beings are fallen creatures and it was the sin in the Garden of Eden that led to this and there wouldn't have been mental aberration. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if two ancient people sinned and brought sin and death and mental illness and aberration into the world. The fact is, all of us here today were born into a world where those things are a reality and they're not the result of any choice or decision we made. Well, it's inherited sin. Inherited sin is unjust. And in any case, whether it's inherited or not, the notion that your mental capacity and somebody else's are vastly different, yet you're going to be judged the same, is asinine. As far as I can tell, this is a strong defeater for Christian models where judgment of our thoughts and deeds are the primary criteria to determine forever, to determine your eternity. Now, obviously for clarities, before people start chopping up bits of this video, I don't think any of that's real. I don't think that there is a God. I don't think that there is sin. I don't think there is an afterlife. I don't think there is this judgment. But you do. And if you do, why would you not care about making it reasonable and teaching someone like me, especially now, because I'm not yet suffering from dementia. I have, as far as I can tell, reasonably good mental faculties, and I'm pretty good at learning and understanding things. And so if you can be the Christian that can explain this, you will have reached an atheist who can then share it with others. I get it. Some of you are going to say, well, I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to bother. Cool. You're allowed to be a lazy believer. But don't expect people to take it seriously. If this is true, if all of this is true, it's got to be the single most important piece of information that anybody could know or understand. And the fact that there's not a God here already clarifying this for us is a big problem. But the fact that even the God believers who claim some sort of special revelation or special understanding of God haven't bothered to sort this out with actual evidence is also a defeater. It's a defeater for the notion that any of you can demonstrate any accurate understanding of the very God that you claim is real, essential, and who will be the judge of all of us. So post your comments explain in the comment section and let me know. How do you reconcile this? Because maybe I'm failing, but I've thought about it a lot and I can't reconcile it. Thanks. We'll see you next time.